I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual now. 起立，面向佛堂，参加先鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位的传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
So it's really good to hear from you, Derek. I was hoping to be able to make it out this week, but I was thwarted, or my efforts were thwarted. So trying to make it again at another time. But and thanks to Alex for the presentation on the Tao of Calm. I'll mirror Derek's observation that I think these things flow in alignment, because my topic for today is the Tao of Enlightenment. And these things are really certainly calm is a precursor to, I think, what one would consider to be enlightenment. This is a rather vague topic that a lot of people I've heard discuss, and is ill-defined, I think, and a little bit difficult to define and to describe. One of the more well-known sutras, the Heart Sutra, talks about, in kind of, well, I guess to paraphrase, talks about it, how it can't be quantified, how this idea of awakening is something that just has to be experienced, and that no matter how hard you try, our attempts to verbalize the experience somehow fall short. And I think that falls in line with something that Derek has talked about from the Tao Te Ching, which is the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. And it's so vast and all-encompassing that to be able to try to limit it to verbal communication is almost a disservice to the entire experience. There is a great deal of literature that is dedicated to this topic, and it's not exclusive to Buddhism or to Taoism. We find it in a variety of philosophical and religious traditions. But I think it's something that we all aspire to. I mean, certainly those who have contemplated deeper principles in life and feel as though there's something beyond the scope of just the material. What is that something, and how do we reach that? How do we touch it? And there are varying methods by which one can move down that road. You know, that's one of the things that I spend a great deal of time exploring, and over the course of my life have embarked on a number of these paths and have tried to study them in as much depth as possible. And more than just study, I think it's really valid and important to actually experience, participate, be in it. I've mentioned to I think, to Root previously about some of my experiences with varying belief sets and people who are indoctrinated into those belief sets, negating the path of other practices. And particularly when one has not fully been immersed in the practice of those other traditions. I have someone that I admire. His name is Thomas Merton, who was a monk that that passed away in, I think, the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And his pursuit was to truly study the practices, religions of the East and see how that contributed or could contribute in alignment to his beliefs as a priest. With a very open-hearted and open-minded perspective. He's written many books, which are wonderful to read and contemplate. So let's take a look at actually the definition, the dictionary definition of enlightenment. Well, maybe I will. So here's the definition, and there are two, there's a literal definition and sort of a generalized definition. The generalized is more at the first part of this. This is from Webster's, Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And it says that enlightenment is the state of having knowledge or understanding, the act of giving someone knowledge or understanding. There was a movement called the Enlightenment, which was in the 18th century, that stressed the belief that science and logic could give people more knowledge and understanding than tradition and religion, which I found somewhat interesting and antithetical to the actual principle of enlightenment that I find familiar, although I would say that the two are inexorably intertwined. If we look at authors like Amit Swami, who is a physicist specializing in quantum physics, there are so many correlations to where we look at the world of science and find that, what did it come from? Well, the world of science evolved from the Tao because it's part of nature. You can't take one away from the other. So these are complementary, but it's very interesting how we tend to segment and compartmentalize these different experiences. So the same word, enlightenment, from the perspective in the 18th century for this movement was all about knowing it from the science end, and then when we see enlightenment in the traditional sense referred to from a Buddhist or an Eastern perspective, it's from the spiritual end. So different perspectives, same principle. And then from Buddhism, a final spiritual state marked by the absence of desire or suffering. And then we move on to the other definitions, which is the act or means of enlightenment, the state of being enlightened. When it's capitalized, again, referring back to the 18th century movement, a philosophical movement from the 18th century marked by a rejection of traditional social, religious, and political ideas and an emphasis on rationalism, the Enlightenment. And then Buddhism, a final blessed state marked by the absence of desire or suffering. Now, I've communicated to you guys several experiences that I've had in my own practice, and as I have been taught from my Buddhist teachers, these are stages along the road. These are gifts that are given that come on unexpectedly, an insight into the true nature of being. And I would assert that these are not exclusive to Eastern traditions either. One of the things that I wanted to bring up today was something that comes from Christianity. And this is a book called The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence was a 17th century monastic who lived in France and who wrote a series of letters to often sisters who were nuns in the Catholic tradition, and it was about his journey. And I'm going to read you part of one of those letters, and if you could bear with me, and then also if anyone has a particular bias against Christian thought, I'd ask that you set this aside for a moment. And just like when I speak with Christians, I say if you could set aside any particular bias that you have against Buddhism and just insert the word God where it says Buddha, I would just ask that you do the same when it refers to God, that you can insert the word Tao or Buddha or mind or whatever your personal path may necessitate. So here is this is an excerpt from one of the letters, and this is from Brother Lawrence speaking to a nun who says, "My Reverend Mother, since you earnestly wish me to impart you the method that I have followed to reach this state of the presence of God, which our Lord in His mercy has allowed me to attain, I must tell you that it is only with great reluctance that I am giving way to your importunities, and only on condition that you will allow no one to see my letter. If I thought you would allow anyone to see it, all my desire for your advancement on the way to perfection would not persuade me to write it. Here is what I can tell you about it." Now, that very first precursor, that first paragraph, is very similar to many teachings that I have received from other teachers who, so in the Vajrayana path, is to not share some of the practices with those who are not initiated into the path, those who have not taken the vows of refuge. And so there's a distinct similarity in the tone and the actual reference to advancement on the way of perfection, which is very common in Buddhist literature. Having found different methods of going to God and different practices to attain the spiritual life in several books, I decided that they would serve more to hinder than facilitate me in what I was seeking, which was nothing other than a means to be wholly God's. This made me decide to give all to gain all. So after having given all to God in satisfaction for my sins, I began to live as if there were no one in this world but Him and me. Sometimes I considered myself before Him as a poor criminal at the feet of His judge. Other times I looked on Him in my heart as my Father and as my God. I adorned Him often as I could, keeping my mind in His holy presence and recalling it as often as it wandered. I had no little difficulty in this exercise, but I kept on despite all difficulties and was not worried or distressed when I was involuntarily distracted. I did this during the day as often as I did it during formal times specifically set aside for prayer. For at times, at every hour, at every moment, even in the busiest times of my work, I banished and put away from my mind everything capable of diverting me from the thought of God. This, Reverend Mother, has been my regular practice ever since I entered religion. Though I have done so imperfectly and faint-heartedly, I have nevertheless received a great many advantages from it. I know well that I have received them through the mercy and goodness of the Lord, since we can do nothing without Him, I even less than others. But keeping ourselves faithfully in His holy presence and keeping Him always before us not only hinders us from offending Him and doing anything that would displease Him, at least voluntarily, it has also given us a holy freedom which allows us to ask Him for the graces we need. So if we take a look particularly at the second paragraph, where he talks about first the principle of humility and giving all to gain all. This is the full commitment to living a spiritual path, to living a life less filled with grasping and just out of the same thing as the Taoists and the Buddhist practice, living minimally without an attachment to the material world as much as is feasible. And then this sense of humility, placing myself as a poor criminal at the judge. Now that may seem somewhat drastic in terms of the comparison, but I would say that when viewed in perspective from his mind state, that would fall very much in line with being like water, which falls to the lowest places and nourishes all. So I think there's a great deal of correlation in that. Also, when he talks about keeping my mind in his holy presence and recalling it as often as it wandered, this is the basic principle of mindfulness. It is being connected to nature, to the Tao, to the source, and then living in that presence consciously and aware, so that we don't cut off, that we don't fall into the habitual pattern of grasping and forcing. So this is why I think this fits in so perfectly with Alex's presentation, and trying to manipulate and force outcomes, whereas the only thing that we can truly moderate is our own perspective, our own reactions, which is easier said than done. But as Brother Lawrence here points out, that he is, I forget how he places it here, but he talks about how he is essentially inept, and how meager his practice, he's been given this gift. Now, it was well known that there was a place in his life where he struggled, and his entire practice was in all of his activities to just live in the presence of God, seek spiritual union. And then in the first phases of his life, he struggled horribly and was angst-ridden. And then at a certain point, there was a tipping point that occurred to where he switched over and he lived in perfect bliss. And that is his testimony. This is why the practitioners of that day wrote to him for advice. And this woman who was afflicted with some deep illness had written to him seeking solace, and was asking him how he was able to attain this state of bliss. And so that's his communication to her. Now, the thing that strikes me is how absolutely similar this is to the paths that are prescribed in Eastern thought when it comes to coming to a state of awakening. So again, we're humans. All of us, no matter what country we come from, no matter what area of the earth, we're biological mechanisms that arrived on this planet by the same means. And the governing forces are the same. Now, our interpretation of that may be different, but I think when we look at the unity of all humans, of all things, of all matter for that, as far as that's concerned, that this is part of that oneness, that innate Tao, that principle that cannot be spoken. It just has to be experienced. So these are our feeble means of communication, and I know that I have certainly struggled with continuing to practice and practice and practice and practice, but I will tell you that just like when you have, speaking of children, when you have children, you don't notice the growth when you're with them. They just magically grow. But think about when you have not seen a child, if you have a friend or a relative, and you visit that person once a year or once every couple of years. You see a child who's 6, then you come back and you see a child who's 9 or 12, and the difference is striking. Wow, look at the advancement. Look at how big you are. Well, I would also suggest that the same can be true of our spiritual advancement, which is manifested in the form of our behavior. I know that I can speak for myself when it comes to rageful behavior, that the people that knew me back in my early 20s, it's just a completely different person. And people now who know me, they say, oh, that couldn't have been you. You couldn't have done that stuff. And, oh, yeah, I did. And it's still, a flame that is inside me. It's still there, but much evolved, and for which I am grateful for that opportunity to have these tools available to me to practice. So comes back to the Tao, in my opinion, the source from which all things emanate and is expressed in different ways among different people. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation today, and thank you, Alex, for your presentation. And back to you, Derek.
Thank you, Ed. On the topic of seeing children change, not being aware of it from day to day, but then not having seen them in a while, then suddenly it's like, whoa, you are now so different. I just want to remind you, Ed, I have that experience with your 2 sons, Jamie and Casey. I first met them when they were teenagers. I gave them comic books, and now they're all grown up. They are adults. They are mature and responsible. Every time I haven't seen either Jamie or Casey in a while, I look at them, or perhaps I look at the like a recent photo in Facebook, and I'm always like, wow, things have changed. Certainly they don't want any more of the comic books that I gave them. They probably have outgrown those comic books.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but yeah, I mean,
okay.
Met Casey when he was 10, I think.
Also, enlightenment is a very timely topic. I find myself thinking about enlightenment quite a bit nowadays because I am working on the 6th Patriarch Platform Sutra. This is an important text in Zen Buddhism, which was founded by Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma, as people may recall from previous talks, is an Indian monk who traveled to China in ancient times. Not only was he the beginning of Zen Buddhism, he was also the beginning of the Shaolin Temple practice of Kung Fu. That art, took on different forms through the ages, and eventually evolved into techniques that Ed has learned as a student of martial arts. Not only that, but Ed has a connection with Shaolin and with Bodhidharma, with Zen Buddhism, that we don't really understand. I can sense that it's definitely there, and it's a very deep connection. So it just happens that we are now sort of working on the same commonality for all of humanity, and this is why when Ed talks about the the interchangeability of God and Buddha and the Tao, that he's actually, that's what he and I are doing, is to explore that common core of humanity.
Well said.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架规则是一鞠躬，接班一鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are done.
Participate in the Tao meeting by joining us online. For information, go to Taoism.net/Tao